So, good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Miller, and this is our free prep hour for April 23rd, 2019. I'm going to be your instructor tonight. I'm based in Durham, North Carolina, and been working for Manhattan Prep for about 5 years now. LSAT is pretty much what I do. It's my main thing that I do, teaching LSAT. I really enjoy doing these free prep hours. They're kind of a nice opportunity for people to come in, get some information. If you're really new to the LSAT, not really sure what it's all about, not really sure if you want to invest in a course or tutoring, and you just want to, get an idea or get some questions answered, these free prep hours are good for that. And we try to go into some detail on some of these questions that we use to give you a real, a fairly in-depth understanding of some of the topics that we discuss. So we do have some other options. So we do these free prep hours twice a month. One of our instructors will come in here, and you can sign up for any of these through our website. We also, as I said, post these videos to YouTube, usually within a few weeks after the session. We have a lot of really good free resources on our website, ManhattanPrep.com website. What I'll do at the end of the session is I'll put a couple of links in the chat window so that you can, if you want to access some of these free resources, you can do that. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, I'm going to reference the chat window. That's for the people who have joined us live tonight in this session. We do have a chat window running that we're communicating in. You'll find the information about the free resources and the links to the free resources down below the video and the information below the video on YouTube. So here's what we're going to talk about tonight. Here is our topic of conversation, assumption questions in logical reasoning. So we're going to focus on the logical reasoning section tonight, specifically on assumption questions. And we're going to use questions from Prep Test 68. So if you have access to the official LSAC prep test book, it's actually in this purple one, 10 actual official, no kidding, for real LSAT prep test, volume 5. This prep test is available there. If you don't have a copy of that prep test, that's okay, because you can follow along on the screen. So let's dive into it. So we're going to be talking about assumption questions tonight. And in order to talk about assumption questions, first we have to talk about arguments, which is usually a useful thing to talk about, because logical reasoning questions, if you've looked at the logical reasoning section at all, and actually let's just do this quickly. Let's just do a quick exercise. Can you tell me, before we talk about arguments, in the chat window, go ahead and click that chat button down at the bottom of the screen if you haven't opened the chat window. Kind of give me an idea of what your familiarity is with the LSAT. I know some of you, I sent out some emails earlier to some of the people who'd registered earlier, and some people gave me a little bit of their background with the LSAT. But if you haven't done that, if you haven't replied to that email that I sent, maybe do that now in the chat window. Just give me a quick overview, like just starting, been doing self-prep, took a course, have taken the LSAT, just in a couple words in the chat window, if you would. Tell me what your experience is with the LSAT. Just to get a feel for the folks who are here tonight. Okay. Okay. All right, good. So a few people just starting out, some people, okay. All right. Okay, so good. So how about we answer this question then? Some of you, I think, are familiar. If you're just brand new to the LSAT, just starting out, that's okay. Hopefully you learned some useful things tonight. What is an argument? Does somebody want to tell me in the chat window? Can you tell me what give me a definition of an argument? Can you give me a definition of an argument? Particularly what we mean when we talk about arguments on the LSAT. Does anybody know? Anybody have a good definition of an argument? Okay, Harleen says proving a point with facts. Chelsea says a premise and a conclusion. Okay, anything else? All right, a claim that is made with a premise and conclusion. Okay, a lot of people are talking about premise and conclusion, so that's great. You nailed it. The definition of an argument, there are a number of definitions of arguments that we can use, but the one we're going to use on the LSAT is that an argument is the use of a supporting premise to justify a conclusion. So what do these words mean, premise and conclusion? Conclusion is a claim. We could say that the whole purpose of an argument, the whole reason an argument exists, is to convince you that the conclusion is true, whatever that conclusion is. We can also call the conclusion the main point of the argument. One important thing to remember on the LSAT is a conclusion may or may not be true. So when you're, reading these arguments on the LSAT and we talk about the conclusion of an argument, always remember that we don't know if the conclusion is true. We never have to accept the conclusion is true. In fact, the whole purpose of the argument, its whole reason for existing, is to try to convince us that the conclusion is true by giving us support. Sometimes we say that the conclusion is like the verdict that you want a jury to reach in a trial, and the premise is like the evidence that you're presenting to try to convince the jury that that conclusion is true. So just to give you an example, let's look at this argument. Here is an example of an argument of the type that you will see on the LSAT. Sam's car stopped running yesterday. Unfortunate for Sam. Therefore, he won't go to the beach this weekend. So notice this conclusion, what we're listing over here as the conclusion, it's a prediction. Right? It's something that's, whoever's making this argument, me in this case, since I'm the one that typed up this slide, I'm trying to make a prediction about what's going on in the future. And, we don't know for sure what's going to happen in the future. So this is something, as always, with a conclusion on the LSAT, may or may not be true. The premise, the support, is that Sam's car stopped running yesterday. Well, okay, it seems like Sam has a problem. If he's not anywhere, unless he lives on the beach and can walk to the beach, then, maybe Sam is going to have trouble going to the beach. So this is what we mean by an argument. This is what we're looking at. There's always going to be some kind of claim in an argument. Might be a prediction. That's very common. Might be a judgment, like something being better than something else or the best. We see a lot of different types of conclusions on the LSAT, but they all tend to be, claims. They all tend to be things that may or may not be true. When we're looking at premises on the LSAT, we tend to deal with facts. Premises, not always, but premises tend to be factual. Because if I'm trying to convince you that my opinion over here is true or my prediction is true, it's better to do that with a fact than with just another opinion. So not always, but often premises are going to be factual. And an argument can have more than one premise, right? If we just have one premise and a conclusion, we have an argument. That's all we need. But often arguments will have multiple premises. So Sam's really having a rough week. Not only did his car stop running yesterday, but he doesn't have enough money to get it fixed. So both of these things together add up to some evidence that I'm trying to use to convince you that Sam won't go to the beach this weekend. So in the chat window, let me know, how are we doing with this? How's everybody doing with this? You doing okay? This might be a review for some people. Okay, Marie says, great, perfect, all good, sounds good. Okay, good. And again, this might be a little bit of a review for some people, but it's such crucial review. 40%, no, not 40%, 80% of all logical reasoning questions start with this. 80% of all logical reasoning questions start with your ability to just look at something, read a little paragraph, and extract the argument from that paragraph, understand the argument being made in that paragraph. So if this is all getting to be second nature to you, that's fantastic. That's the way we'd like it to be. All right. So what's an assumption? You guys did a good job. We had some really good answers to my questions earlier about what an argument is. So what about an assumption? If the LSAT in a logical reasoning question mentions an assumption, what are they talking about? A prediction, okay. What else? What are your other ideas? A possibility, okay. Anybody else? A foundation that underlies the premise and conclusion, a foundation. It's a gap. Let's fill in the logic between the premise and the conclusion. All right. I like all these answers. I like a lot of these answers. I like all these answers. I'm seeing some good things here. So but we want to be really specific. So here's what I'm going to say. Those are some really good answers, but we need to be very narrow and specific when we talk about an assumption on the LSAT in logical reasoning, because it has a very specific definition. Well, maybe rather than definition, we'll say it has some very specific characteristics. So an assumption is not explicitly stated in the argument. If I ask you for an assumption in this argument and you say something like, oh, well, the argument's assuming that Sam won't go to the beach this weekend. That's not correct. It's a lot of people would say that, but the reason it's not correct is because that's the conclusion of the argument. This argument doesn't assume that Sam won't go to the beach this weekend. This argument concludes that Sam won't go to the beach. So conclusion and assumption are two separate things. You want to keep them separate in your mind. An assumption is not explicitly stated. An assumption also doesn't simply reinforce something that's already stated. So, and this can get a little tricky because some people would say like, oh, well, this argument's assuming that, you know, I mean, if you just take a moment and read this down here at the bottom of the screen. Not a repair shop anywhere near the place where Sam lives that will fix his car for the amount of money that Sam has. So you might say, well, yeah, that's like an assumption because it seems to be going like one step beyond what's stated in the argument, but really it's not. It says right here, Sam doesn't have enough money to get his car fixed. So this isn't really giving us any new information. This thing down here at the bottom is kind of already covered by our premises. It's not an assumption. So we're not just reinforcing something that's already stated. Sometimes we call those premise boosters, something that reinforces, but it's not an assumption. So what is an assumption? And I think a couple people actually pointed this out. An assumption helps the premise or premises support the conclusion. So this is what you need to know about a lot of LSAT arguments. A lot of LSAT arguments are broken. There are problems with them. They're not good arguments. And so there's something wrong. The premises don't fully support the conclusion. And an assumption is something that's going to help those premises that we have support the conclusion that we're given. So let's debate this argument for a second. Like we said, this is actually, like I'm going to tell you right up front, this is a broken argument. This is not a convincing argument. How would you debate this argument? What would you say if I said, what's wrong with this argument? How could you convince me that there's a problem? Maybe I think this is a great argument. I just wrote this argument today. I think it's fantastic. I like it. How would you convince me that I don't understand arguments, that there's actually a problem? There's a big gaping hole in this argument. Scott says his car is not the only mode of transportation to get to the beach. Yeah, so what you just came up with is an objection, right? And so when we talk about debating arguments on the LSAT, that's basically, not always, but often what we're talking about. Can you voice an objection? You know, there are other forms of transportation. What else? So Alexander says, you know, it's concluding that he won't be able to go to the beach. That by itself, what the argument is concluding, isn't necessarily a problem with the argument because you could have the premises fully support the conclusion, right? So just because an argument's concluding something, that by itself is not a problem with the argument. It's why don't these premises support the conclusion? And what else? You could have friends take them. So I like these. I like that, Tyler. Maybe his friends will take him. And I kind of gave one away, a possible objection earlier. Maybe he lives at the beach, right? He's stuck at home because his car is broken, and darn it, he's just got to spend all weekend at the beach. Yeah, so you guys are coming up with some really good objections. So one of this is truth versus validity. Harleen, what do you mean by truth versus validity? Do you want to, if you want to, you should be able to click on your talk button down near the bottom of the screen. Do you want to hop on the mic and tell me what you mean by that?
Yeah, where it's primarily connected with the validity. It's like the logical relationship of the pieces of the argument. Right?
Well, yeah, like there's a problem with the validity of the argument. I want to circle back to validity in a minute, in a couple minutes, actually. So I'm going to say you're right that there's a problem with the validity. Now, you mentioned truth. One thing to be aware of, I'm just going to mention that for a second because you mentioned it. One thing to be aware of is on the LSAT, we don't care about factual truth, right? Like we've been sitting here talking about this argument and what the premises are, what the conclusion is. You guys are probably like, you know, following along, nodding your head, buying into this argument. You're seeing that, you know, you're coming up with objections. But this is a totally fictional argument. Sam who? What beach are we talking about? What car? None of this is factual. So on the LSAT, we're not concerned with factual truth. We're not going to worry about whether any of the premises are real or true. In fact, if you identify something on the LSAT as a premise, just accept it. Just accept that there is someone named Sam, that Sam's car stopped running yesterday, and that he doesn't have enough money to get it fixed. We're going to accept those as facts. We're not going to object to this argument by saying, hey, maybe Sam does have enough money and he's just lying, right? That's not how we're going to object. So we're not concerned with factual truth. We're concerned with validity, with logical links. All right, good. So, Now, one of the questions, somebody, you have the opportunity, if you get those emails that they send you, or the one that I sent out, or the one that our student services team sends out when you first sign up for these, there's a form that you can, when you sign up for one of these free prep hours, we send you an email, and there's a link to a form that you can fill out with questions. And I try to look at those before class. If anybody filled in any questions right before class, I might not have seen it, but one of the questions that someone asked that I really want to focus on a little bit tonight is the difference between the different types of assumptions that you're going to see on the LSAT. So one of the types of assumptions that, there are basically two types of assumptions that we're going to talk about in the LSAT. And one of the types of questions you're going to see is going to be asking you about a necessary assumption. So these are both, pretty decent objections to the argument. Maybe someone's going to lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed. Maybe someone will give Sam a ride to the beach. So both of these are objections that would break my argument. Either of these objections, either one, if they're true, if either one of these objections is true, then it's shattering the link between my premise and conclusion. My premises no longer support that conclusion if either of these objections are true. So in order for this argument to have any hope of surviving, in order for this argument to have any hope of being convincing, then it is necessary to assume that both of these things, each of these things individually, each of these things, I won't say both, I'll just say each individually, number one here and number two here. It is necessary to assume each of these things. It's necessary to assume that no one will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed. It's necessary to assume that no one will give Sam a ride to the beach. These are both things that are necessary to assume. Now, notice that neither of these things alone convinces us that the argument is valid, right? That the conclusion is fully supported by the premises. Because, okay, what if both of these things are true? Sure, check. I get it. No one's going to lend Sam the money. Sure, no one's going to give him a ride. But what if he still lives right by the beach, right? So a necessary assumption by itself doesn't convince us that the conclusion is true. What I want you to think about when you think about necessary assumptions is something that defends the argument, against a possible objection. So that's what each of these statements does. Each one of these defends the argument against a possible objection. If it's not true, if either of these things aren't true, then one of these objections might be true, and this argument no longer makes sense. Questions about that? Give me an okay in the chat window if you are following along, if this seems pretty reasonable. Give me a no, or I have a question in the chat window if you want to hop on the mic and ask a question. All right, people are saying all good. Excellent. All right. Okay, so let's keep rolling. We want to try to cover a few things tonight. So I'm going to show you a question. What I'll do is give everybody a minute or two to look at this. Maybe we'll say 2 minutes. We'll start off a little slow. Go ahead and see if you can answer this question, for real live question from the LSAT. And if you come up with a correct answer, if you would please put it in the chat window. If you have a correct answer for this question, type it in the chat window and send it to me. All right, that was about 2 minutes. We have a few different answers coming in, a few different opinions, some with question marks about what the correct answer is. So let's go ahead and pick this apart. So the first thing we want to do, this is always a good idea. I always recommend doing this in logical reasoning. So we have 3 parts to a logical reasoning question. We have the stimulus up top, the little paragraph. We have the question stem, and then we have the answer choices. I always recommend that you read the question stem first for 2 reasons. First of all, different questions are going to ask you to do different things. And you always want a clear idea of what your task is. We're going to talk about 2 specific questions tonight, but they're 2 out of, practically a dozen types of questions that you're going to see on the LSAT. And so you always want to read the question stem first so you know what your task is. It will give you a clear idea what you look for and what you should be considering when you read the stimulus, the little paragraph up here. And these questions, sometimes you'll get to the point where you just recognize one of these question stems because you've seen it before. And so now you know right away what to do. But even if you don't, these are giving you some really useful information. I mean, you should realistically be able to answer these questions just based on the information they give you here on the page. So this is telling you there's an argument. So you know right away, just in the first 2 words, you know that you want to look for what we were just talking about. When you read this paragraph, you want to find the argument. And then it's talking about an assumption. So you know that your requires assuming which one of the following. So you know that the answer choice, the correct answer choice, is an assumption for the argument. And requires gives us useful information too. It means it's a necessary assumption, the kind of assumption that we were just talking about. An assumption, something that has to be true to defend the argument against a possible objection. With that knowledge, let's read the little paragraph up here. What I did is I broke it down a little bit, and I think this is a really useful thing to do. Unfortunately, you can't do this on paper. I mean, you can try. You can I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't take the time, and don't take the time to write out every statement separately. But you should learn to read this way. This is a really useful way to read on the LSAT. So as you're reading these questions, try to pause momentarily at the end of every distinct thought, every statement, every clause, if you want to get grammarly here. So the chairperson of Acme Corporation has decided to move the company from its current location in Milltown to Ocean View. Okay, pause. Most Acme employees cannot afford housing within a 30-minute of Ocean View. Okay, so these are 2 facts. Sounds like we have a couple facts here. So once the company is moved, most Acme employees will have a commute of more than 30 minutes. So notice again, a prediction here, right? This is our conclusion. This last sentence is the conclusion. Give me an okay in the chat window or a yes in the chat window if you recognized when you were working on this that last sentence was the conclusion. When you were working on this, did you recognize that the last sentence was the conclusion? Okay, good, bravo. A couple ways we know that. First of all, it's the only thing in here that's not factual. It's the only thing in here that's and again, we don't have to know whether any of these things are factually true. We don't have to know if there really is an Acme Corporation in Milltown, but these things are represented on the page as facts. This is, a prediction. Also, this keyword, so, therefore, indicates that this is the conclusion being drawn from these premises. Okay, so this is always going to be your first step. When I'm working on these questions, I have a very narrow focus when I'm working on these questions, and I recommend you do the same thing. As you're reading this question, the first thing we want to do is just identify each piece of this. And we want to make sure we're really clear about what the argument is. So, we definitely need to know what the conclusion is. We definitely need to identify that last sentence there as the conclusion. Now, would you say that both of these are premises? Would you say that both of these other 2 statements, the first and second sentence, are both premises? What do you think? Maybe I'll ask it a different way. If I label them 1 and 2, which one, 2, or both, do you think provides, or is whoever's making this argument, which one do you think, 1 or 2 or both, which one do you think they're trying to use to convince you that the conclusion is true? Which one seems to be the most direct support for the conclusion? Is it statement number 1? Yeah, a lot of people saying 2. Yeah, so number 1, we call it background information. Just, okay, great. Chairperson has decided to move the company from its current location in Milltown to Ocean View. That's just giving us some context. The real support is that the employees can't afford housing within a 30-minute a commute of Ocean View. From that, we're going to conclude that most employees will have a commute of more than 30 minutes. What I'm going to suggest that you do, I always suggest this to my students, is if you're working on questions, if you're working on these logical reasoning questions, and you're not getting this clear of a view of just the stimulus, the argument, you can't clearly identify each separate statement, identify the conclusion, and identify which statements are the most direct support for the conclusion, the actual support, because they will put other things in, like, like that first sentence, which we're really not interested in. This first sentence isn't really the support for the conclusion. So you want to be able to identify the premise and the conclusion. If you can't do that, then don't go to the answer choices. Spend a little more time on the premise, on the stimulus, on the argument, identifying the premises and conclusion before you go to the answer choices. And then, because, and it might seem like you're working really slow, like, go ahead and put your feet up, grab a drink and put your feet up and relax for a few minutes and really work with this stimulus until you're crystal clear about what the premise and the conclusion are. You'll get faster at it. The more of these questions you work on, the faster you'll get at it. But if you're like rushing through without this kind of a clear understanding and then just diving through the answer choices, it's really hard to answer the question correctly. Another thing that's good to do is pause for a moment and do what we did a second ago with the SAM and the car and the beach, and like debate the argument for a moment. So what's wrong with this argument? Most employees will have a commute of more than 30 minutes. Well, why are they going to have a commute of 30 minutes? Because most can't afford housing within the 30-minute commute of Ocean View. I mean, it might sound like a really good argument at first, but there's always something wrong with these arguments, and you want to be able to identify it. So, why is, what's an objection? What's a possible objection here? Like, I'll just give you one. First one comes to mind. Maybe the company is going to build housing, right? Maybe Acme Corporation is going to build housing on site for the Acme employees, and they can all live there at the factory. Sounds absolutely dreadful to me. But although there's a company near where I live here in North Carolina, that they have this like really big campus, and they got these like really nice cafeterias and workout rooms and nap rooms. And it's like, yeah, people can you could practically live there. So, but it's still, I'm not sure I'd really want to, but there you go. Like, there's a real world possibility where, well, maybe I don't have to, have this more than 30-minute commute. So it's always good to do that. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but see, before you look at answer choices, definitely be clear about what the argument is, and then see if you can take a moment and come up with a possible objection, especially for these necessary assumption questions. It doesn't mean you're going to predict the right answer, but it can help you evaluate the answers more easily. So let's look at the answer choices now. Let's just go through these. All Acme employees can afford housing within a 30-minute commute of Milltown. Do we have to assume that all Acme employees can afford housing within a 30-minute commute of Milltown? Can anybody tell me why? I'm just going to tell you right now. Answer choice A, alpha, is wrong. It is incorrect. Can anybody tell me why? Give me a me in the chat window if you want to try to hop on the mic. And so Arya says too strong. Arya, do you want to hop on the mic and explain why this is too strong? Oh, you're in the library? Sorry. Okay, no problem. No problem. A lot of people are saying all. Okay, what if it said some? What if it said some Acme employees can afford housing within a 30-minute commute of Milltown? Would it be a right answer then? Because that's not very strong. It's still not a right answer, yeah, because this is talking about Milltown. This is talking about where the place is currently located. That's that context, that background context actually does help us a little bit. But we're talking about whether people can afford housing within a 30-minute commute of Ocean View. And we're trying to support, again, a conclusion about what happens once the company is moved. So it's not necessary to assume anything about whether they can or can't afford housing in Milltown. Maybe they already, this is a very logical, lawyerly way of looking at this, but notice nothing in here tells us where these employees live now. It's just saying the company's current location is in Milltown. And then it starts talking about what's going to happen in Ocean View. So we have no idea what's going on in Milltown. And furthermore, they're not using anything. They're not using the idea that the employees, maybe it seems like they are, right? Maybe you're making that little connection in your mind. Maybe it seems like they're saying, oh yeah, all the employees in Milltown, they can live within a 30-minute commute. It doesn't say that though. And we're not trying to use that as support for the conclusion. So we don't care whether some or most or all employees. We don't care how many employees can afford housing within a 30-minute commute of Milltown. It's not part of the support for the argument. Some of you are jumping on all because we do say sometimes that strong language is suspicious in necessary assumption questions. If that's the only reason that you eliminated answer choice A, I'm going to call it a crutch. One of my coworkers was using this term not long ago, one of my colleagues that I was teaching with, and I agree with it. Language strength, like there are some question types where we are suspicious of strong language, and other question types where strong language is okay. But if that's your go-to method, if you're looking at every one of these answer choices, if you just look at answer choice A and say, oh, I'm going to eliminate it because all is really strong language, don't do that, because you're going to get questions wrong. You're going to get questions wrong for that reason. You need to look beyond the language strength and look at the actual thing that answer choice A is telling us, and it's not something that's necessary to assume. So look at content first. Look and see if ask yourself, what is answer choice A saying? What's it talking about? It's talking about whether employees can afford housing within a 30-minute commute of Milltown, and I don't care about that. Right? Language strength is sometimes a way, it can be a good guessing strategy. Like if you're down to 2 answer choices, you've eliminated 3 answer choices, you have 2 left, you have no idea which one's wrong. For certain types of questions, you might be better off picking a strong answer or picking a weak answer. But that only works if you've already eliminated others for legitimate reasons or other reasons, more logical reasons. So we don't care whether or not they can and can't afford housing within a 30-minute commute of Milltown. Answer choice B, nobody picked B. The chairperson of ACME has good financial reasons for wanting to move the company to Ocean View. Again, this is one of those, I think we call it like a premise booster sometimes. I mentioned it earlier. We already know that the chairperson has decided to move the company. We don't need to know why. We don't have to assume anything about why. We're told that they're moving the company. And then the conclusion is based on once the company has moved. We don't need to know why. None of ACME's employees except the chairperson are in favor of moving the company. So it kind of seems maybe like I could see some people picking this because the conclusion doesn't sound very good, right? The conclusion sounds kind of, it sounds like a very unhappy conclusion. Oh yeah, once the company's moved, most ACME employees will have a commute of more than 30 minutes. But notice that C is kind of going beyond the argument. It's like you're saying, oh, so because we know the employees will have a commute of more than 30 minutes, we're going to assume that the employees are not in favor of it. I think that's why people would pick C. But that's not what we mean by assumption. That's not what we mean by an assumption that's required. This is something that goes beyond, it's a step beyond the argument, and it's not the definition of the assumption that we're looking for, linking the premise to the conclusion. Currently, most ACME employees have a commute of less than 30 minutes. All right, so now we're down to D and E. And this is not a bad situation to be in. This is actually a good situation to be in. If you can quickly eliminate 3 answer choices, if you can quickly see why they're wrong and valid reasons why they're wrong, not just, oh yeah, that has not just one word, all, or a language strength issue, but actual content issues in these answer choices that make them incorrect, that make them not something we have to assume to connect this premise to this conclusion. They're not necessary to assume to make that link we need. Well, now we're down to 2 answer choices. We have to figure out which one's correct. Does somebody, give me a yes in the chat window if you picked answer choice D and you think it's correct and you want to tell me why you think it's correct. Does anybody want to defend D? I got a note. Nope. Not me. Yeah, so let's just look at D. Currently, most ACME employees have a commute of less than 30 minutes. Again, this is about, maybe I gave it away earlier, this is about currently, and our conclusion is about once the company has moved. So once we're in Ocean View. So we don't have to assume anything. I think destroyed D kind of when I was talking about A, but we don't have to assume anything about what's happening at Milltown. What's happening right now in Milltown isn't the support for the conclusion. All the support is about what's going to happen once the let me say this correctly. The support is about what's going on in Ocean View. and whether or not the employees can or cannot afford housing in Ocean View. They're not using anything happening in Milltown. They're not making a claim that the employees can currently afford housing there or they have a less than 30-minute commute. That's not really, it's maybe seems like it when you first read it, but that's not part of the argument. It's not part of the support that's being given. So we're left with E. Acme's move to Ocean View will not be accompanied by a significant pay raise for Acme employees. So think about it. What would be a really good objection for this argument, right? What would be a really good objection? Like one of the objections we could come up with is, hey, maybe they're going to give everybody a raise. Maybe the chairperson knows that Acme employees can't afford housing within a 30-minute Ocean View, a 30-minute commute of Ocean View, and they don't want the employees to be unhappy. So maybe this would be a possible objection. What if they give everybody a raise? What if they know they're moving to a more expensive place, and so they're going to give everybody a cost of living raise? That would be an objection, and what E is doing is defending against that objection. That's why answer choice E is correct. So what I'd like you to take away from this, first of all, if you have a question, say, hey, I have a question in the chat window. But what I want you to take away from this, a couple things. The process, right? Think about the process that we followed, not just what's the right answer, or not just, oh yeah, I thought A was right, so cool, I'm right. But what are the steps that you followed? Can you answer the question faster than you did? Because we got some answers coming in pretty quickly, but honestly, if you're shooting for, let's say, like a 170 score, high 160s, 170 or above, you should be able to answer this question in less than a minute. And the more under a minute, the better. So we're always looking for better ways to answer. We're always looking for better ways to approach the question. Make sure you know what the question's asking. Make sure that you identify what we call the argument core, the premise and the conclusion. Make sure you know what parts of this paragraph are, make sure you know what the conclusion is and what parts of the paragraph are actually the support, and what is the stuff that they're putting in here just to kind of distract you. And then once you're focusing on the argument itself, that what we call the core of the argument core, the premise and the conclusion, the direct support and the conclusion, then you can more effectively evaluate the answer choices. And you'll see that some of these are just not about that link that we're trying to make. So let me see a question. We have a question in the chat window. The conclusion is saying that most Acme employees will have a commute more than 30 minutes. Yep. I don't understand why we wouldn't assume now that they'd have less than a 30-minute commute. Why wouldn't we assume that? Well, what happens if they do have a commute of less than 30 minutes? How does that affect the argument? Like, let's go back to what this argument is saying. Let's go back to the premise and the conclusion. The conclusion is saying, once the company is moved, most Acme employees will have a commute of more than 30 minutes. The premise is that they can't afford housing within a 30-minute commute of Ocean View. So we don't have to assume that most employees have a commute of less than 30 minutes. Because maybe, like, let me phrase the question this way. Let me phrase the argument this way. Currently in Milltown, most Acme employees can't afford housing within 30 minutes, within a 30-minute commute of Milltown. And most Acme employees now currently have a commute of more than 30 minutes. Most Acme employees can't afford housing within a 30-minute commute of Ocean View. So once the company is moved, most Acme employees will have a commute of more than 30 minutes. So what we're saying in that case, if they can't afford housing within 30 minutes of Milltown, and so they already have a 30-minute commute, all we're saying is that things are going to stay the same. Now, if I change this, if I say most employees can afford housing within 30 minutes of Milltown. So currently, most employees have less than a 30-minute commute. And then I give you the same argument. Most employees can't afford housing within a 30-minute commute of Ocean View. So I could give you the same argument, and it doesn't matter what the current situation is. It doesn't matter whether when they move to Ocean View, things are going to stay the same or they're going to change. The argument remains the same. The argument that, because what we're talking about, the entire scope of the argument is what's going to happen. The entire scope of the premise, the support, and the conclusion is about what's going to happen once the company is moved. And in order to make this connection between whether or not they can afford housing and what commute they're going to have, It's all about what's going to happen once the company is moved. It doesn't matter what the current situation is, whether it's the same now or whether it's changing. Does that help, Chelsea? Does that help maybe see what you're getting at? Or maybe I misunderstood your question. It's a really good question, and it seems like that's what they're saying. It seems like they're saying, hey, things are going to change, but they're not. There's nowhere in terms of what's actually on the screen right now. There's nowhere that it claims, the argument is not saying things will change. It says once the company is moved, but that doesn't necessarily mean things are changing, right? I can say, I really like going to the beach, and I'm going to move to Florida. Once I've moved, I'm going to go to the beach a lot, right? It could mean that I currently go to the beach a lot now, or it could mean that I don't. The premise, doesn't really depend on the current situation. Yeah. Okay, cool. Excellent. It's a really good question. I think that's the thing that people get hung up on in this question is, these first couple answer choices. All right. So answer choice A and answer choice D, the ones that deal with the current situation. All right. So let's move on a little bit. So one of the things I said that we would talk about is the two types of questions. So I see a question from Harleen. How do you go about a question that says strongly assumed? I'm not sure of that question type. I'm not sure of a question type that says which of the following is strongly assumed. We have questions that are strongly supported. Which of the following is most strongly supported, or which of the following most strongly supports the argument? Maybe that's what you're thinking of. I'm not sure of the question type you're talking about that says strongly assumed. It's either assumed or it's not. It's an argument. It's an assumption that the argument depends on, or it could be this this other type of argument. So let's look at this. So yeah, I'm just not sure of the question type you're talking about. I don't think I've seen that, Arlene. I think you're thinking of a different thing where we talk about strongly supported. That's a different type of question. All right. So let's look at this other question. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to give everybody a minute. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to work on this. Same as before. Go ahead and put your answers in the chat window when you have an answer. Okay. All right. So see some different answers coming in the chat window. Thanks to everybody who answered. So this is a different type of question. We're dealing with a different type of question here. Again, one of the questions that somebody asked earlier when we in the survey that we asked people to fill out before the session, somebody asked for the difference, to explain the difference between a sufficient assumption and a necessary assumption. And I said earlier that there are two types of assumption questions that you're going to see on the LSAT. We've talked about necessary assumptions and this wording that we saw. Which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? And just to go back to that, because I really want to emphasize that difference. When a question asks about, when the question stem here is talking about an argument and an assumption, and it talks about language of requirement, you see language of requirement. The argument requires assuming which of the following. Which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? Then we're talking about a necessary assumption question, which is the type we've been talking about so far. But now notice that this is a different question stem. This is asking us, the conclusion drawn above follows logically if which of the following is assumed. So we know that there's an argument. They're talking about a conclusion and they're talking about an assumption. But this isn't saying depends. This isn't saying required. It's saying if one of the following is assumed, the conclusion follows logically. So this term follows logically, or you might see properly inferred. The conclusion can be properly inferred if which of the following is assumed. So now we're talking about a sufficient assumption question, a different type of questions. It's similar to what we've been talking about. We're still dealing with an argument, premise and conclusion, premises and conclusion. We're still dealing with an assumption in an argument. We're still dealing with a broken argument, an argument where the premises do not fully support the conclusion. But they're asking you for something different. They're not asking you for an assumption that's required, that has to be there to defend the argument against an objection. What they're asking is for something that would completely link the premise and the conclusion. So I want everybody to look at this argument for a moment. Can you give me one statement in the chat window, a short statement in the chat window that would completely link these premises to this conclusion? Can you add a single statement to this argument that would allow these premises to fully support the conclusion and convince us that the conclusion is true? Somebody put that in the chat window. Give everybody a moment to think about it. Okay. Brittany said, Sam has no other way to the beach. Anne said, if-then statement. Yeah, if-then statements are pretty good here. Sam has no other way to the beach. But what if he lives at the beach, right? What if he doesn't need what if he already lives at the beach? The beach is only accessible by car. None of Sam's friends or family has a car. All right, Scott, you're on the right track, but what if somebody lends him money to get the car fixed? Right? Well, then, okay, so everything you're saying is true. The beach is only accessible by car, and none of his friends have a family or family have a car, but maybe he still can't get to the beach. So what we're looking for here is something that's kind of, it sometimes seems remarkably similar. I'm just going to show it to you. And you mentioned an if-then statement. So if Sam does not have enough money to get his car fixed, then he will not go to the beach this weekend. This is a sufficient assumption for this argument. If we were to take this bottom statement here and add it to the argument, treat it like a premise. Now, all three of these premises together, right? The two premises we were given here, number one and number two, along with this new thing, which we're calling a sufficient assumption, all of this together adds up to convince us that our conclusion is true. If this is the definition of a valid argument. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. That's what we mean by a valid argument. And when they ask you which of the following, if assumed, allows the conclusion to be properly inferred, or the conclusion follows logically if which one of the following is assumed, that's what they mean. They mean that if you add the answer choice to the existing argument, then the conclusion has to be true. And a couple things I want to point out, these if-then statements on the LSAT, right? If Sam, these are really strong statements. Like if I say, if I'm in New York City, then I'm in the USA, then means must be true on the LSAT, right? We use this little arrow to mean then. So if I'm in New York City, it must be true that I'm in the USA. This is very powerful language. And it may seem a little redundant. That's the other thing that people think when they see sufficient assumptions. It seems a little redundant, right? I mean, isn't this, or don't we already know this? We actually don't. Notice that this statement, Sam's car stopped running yesterday, and he doesn't have enough money to get it fixed, doesn't tell us anything about the beach. These premises don't mention going to the beach this weekend. This isn't simply repeating anything that we already have. It's making the connection that we need to connect the premises to the conclusion. So this is what we're looking for in assumption, a sufficient assumption. Broad statements are great. Strong statements are great for sufficient assumption questions. We're looking for something that will absolutely allow us to connect the premises to the conclusion. So this is that will completely prove if these premises are true, then this statement, if we add it to the argument, is enough to convince us, all these combined, that the conclusion is also true. So let's go back to this one we were looking at here, this question we were looking at. That's what a sufficient assumption is all about. So this is what it's asking us for. The conclusion above follows logically if which of the following is assumed. Okay, well, what's our argument? Our conclusion down here, again, we have this keyword so, right? An indicator. It's like therefore, thus. No one who knows him will be surprised that Ellsworth is offended by the suggestions in the media that he's engaged in unethical business practices. All right. So it's a prediction. Nobody knows him will be surprised. What are the premises then? What's the support? Anyone who knows him knows he is bursting with self-righteousness and touting the idealism that his generation of his generation over the greed of the previous generation. So he's self-righteousness, touting the idealism of his generation, doesn't like the previous generation. These are the things that we're given as facts about Ellsworth. And now we're making this prediction that says he's offended by the suggestions in the media, that he's engaged in unethical business practices. Notice how this conclusion is like all a bunch of new information. Like, okay, so he's self-righteous, so he's touting the idealism of his generation and talking about the greed of the previous generation. What does that have to do with him being offended? Like, self-righteous, touting idealism, doesn't necessarily, touting idealism over greed of the previous generation, doesn't necessarily mean he's offended. So where did offended come from? Just because Joe's car is broken and just because he doesn't have money, how do we know, what does that have to do with going to the beach? Right? How do we know that those premises prove anything about going to the beach? And also notice that this is talking about suggestions in the media and that he's engaged in unethical business practices. So this is what we have to do. We have to we need a statement. We need to add a premise to this argument that tells us how does self-righteousness, the idealism of the generation over the greed of previous generations, how does all that convince me that he's offended by the suggestions in the media about his unethical business practices? So now we're looking for answer choices that did it. Yeah, like, maybe he's not offended, right? So you come up with objections, Harley, and I like it. All right, so let's look at these answer choices. Everyone suspects self-righteous people of being in actuality unethical. All right. So this would maybe convince us that no one who knows him will be surprised that he's unethical. But notice that's not actually what the conclusion's saying. The conclusion isn't actually saying that he's unethical. The conclusion is saying that he's offended by the suggestions that he's engaged in unethical business practices. Notice, one of the things that the LSAT's testing is your ability to read very literally. This conclusion doesn't tell us whether he is or isn't unethical. It might seem like it is. You might think, oh, so he's not unethical. That's why he's offended. But that's additional information that you're adding while you're reading it. This conclusion, if you literally, let me clear all this stuff off so you can read it. Nothing in that conclusion tells us whether or not he actually is ethical or unethical. So why, we don't need to know that self-righteous people are unethical. That doesn't help us prove this conclusion about him being offended by suggestions in the media. We don't know whether he's ethical or unethical. Ellsworth has been accused of unethical business practices before. Okay, so then why is he offended? Like, this doesn't, just because he's been accused of unethical business practices before, does that tell us whether he's offended? Because that's what the conclusion is about him really being offended by the suggestion in the media. This doesn't tell us whether or not he would be offended. Hypocrites often hide behind righteous indignation. Hypocrites? Is he a hypocrite? I mean, so in this type of question, a sufficient assumption question, we're very suspicious of new information. Like that last question talking about raises, new information, like that answer choice E in that last question was talking about raises, which was something that wasn't mentioned at all in the argument, but that's fine for a necessary assumption question, right? For this question, when we're asking for a sufficient assumption, new information is really suspect. Ellsworth is in fact innocent of all wrongdoing. Again, we don't care whether he's innocent or not, and innocent of all wrongdoing. This is about whether or not he would be offended and about whether we would be surprised that he's offended. So we're down to answer choice E. Everyone expects self-righteous people to be easily offended. We know that he's self-righteous, right? The premise tells us that he's self-righteous. And then we're concluding that he's offended. And so this is the answer choice that connects self-righteous with offended. Brittany said you guessed it, but you're unsure. So Brittany, this is a really good thing to close with. We're getting towards the end of the hour here, and that's a really good thing to close with. You might find for a lot of these questions that you kind of have a hunch that you pick an answer choice and you kind of have a hunch that you're correct, right? And like, I think answer choice E is right, so let me just pick it. And I'm just, Brittany put in the chat window, I guessed E, but I was really unsure. A lot of people do that, right? E looks right, so they select it. And then it is right. Then I'm sitting here telling you, yep, E is right. And you go, oh, whew, got one right. But you never want to be satisfied with that. So one of the things we were doing here is looking at, a couple things we did. We want to be really clear about what the question is asking. I mean, if you're really serious about preparing for the LSAT, you're going to need to understand the different question stems you're asking, the different question stems you're going to see, and what that question is actually asking you to do. And if they're talking about an assumption and an argument, conclusion, then your job is to find the argument. Make sure you understand what the conclusion is. I'll put a C next to this for conclusion. Make sure you're clear about the premises. What are the premises in this argument? And then understand that we're talking about assumption means connection between premises and conclusion. And not just understanding that E actually gives us that connection that we need between self-righteousness and easily offended, but also understand why the wrong answers are wrong. Because part of your speed on the LSAT is going to come from being able to look at an answer choice like A and realize, no, we don't care whether or not he's actually unethical. We don't care whether or not he's innocent. That's not what our conclusion's about. Our argument doesn't actually mention hypocrites at all. And he's been accused of unethical business practices before. Okay, then why is he offended? How does that help us know whether or not he's offended? So being able to look at these answer choices and know why they're wrong, that's what you want to get out of your review whenever you're working on these questions. So we're doing a couple things in these free prep hours. We're trying to talk you through these questions so you understand them better, right? You understand what these questions are asking. What does the LSAT mean by an argument? What does it mean by assumed? So just some of the language, understanding some of the language. We're also trying to take you through a process. Like, how do you actually, attack this question? What are the steps that you should follow? Once you read that question stem, what's the next thing that you do? But then also, what I hope you're getting out of this is seeing like a pattern that we're following in analyzing these questions after you work on them. And that's one of the most valuable things that you can do if you really want to improve your LSAT score. Don't just work on a question once and then find out whether you're right or wrong and then move on. Before you even know whether you're right or wrong, before you even check answers, go back and review questions that you're not sure of. You should be marking questions as you work, like, oh, this one was really hard. I'm really not sure of my answer here. And then review it first try to pick it apart yourself before you go and look at what the answer is. That's how you're going to improve your understanding and improve your score. So Maurice has a good question in the chat window. Are we always looking at topics in the conclusion to determine our answer choices? So the answer to that is no, Maurice. Not every question on the LSAT is going to ask you, in logical reasoning, not every question is going to ask you about an assumption, and not every one of these paragraphs includes an argument. So if there is a conclusion, if the question stem talks about a conclusion or talks about an argument or talks about reasoning. If you see any of those three words in the question stem talks about a conclusion, talks about reasoning, talks about an argument. Another one that you'll see is hypothesis. Sometimes they like to get these science questions in there, and they'll talk about hypothesis or a theory. Can't type tonight. Can't type at all tonight. So in each of these cases, there's some kind of claim being made and some kind of support for that claim. And then your job is to recognize that. What's the claim that's being made and what is the support for that claim? So the same thing we're doing here, premise and conclusion. So yeah, in those types of questions, if the question stem talks about any of these things, then yes. Or if it talks about an assumption, that's another dead giveaway where they just flat out say, hey, you're looking for an assumption. If you're looking for an assumption, then there has to be an argument for there to be an assumption. So these are all the words that indicate that, okay, I need to go and find an argument in there. I need to find the conclusion and the premises and the support for that conclusion. That's your first step if you see those words. And then, yes, you are going to use that understanding, not just the conclusion itself, but understanding the link, the premises they're trying to give you to support that conclusion, and then why do those premises not really support that conclusion? What's missing from the argument? Or what's an objection you could bring up that would harm the argument? That's a little bit of a lengthy explanation maybe to your answer to your question, Maurice, but the answer is no, you're not always looking for an argument or a conclusion, and that the answer choices aren't always based on that. Although in 80% of logical reasoning questions, you are. 80% of logical reasoning questions involve doing the kind of work we're doing here. Really, the big difference is there's a whole class of if you've taken any of our courses or used any of our materials, like our LSAT Interact self-study course or our strategy guides, there's a whole class of LR questions that we talk about that are called assumption family questions. And really, the basic steps are the same. They're all talking about one of these things: conclusion, reasoning, argument, assumption. The difference between those questions are what you do once you understand what the argument is. What is the question asking you to do? What is the question asking you to look for in the answer choices? Maybe they're asking you to strengthen the argument. Maybe they're asking you to weaken the argument. Maybe they're asking you for a flaw in the argument. But it all starts with understanding the pieces of the argument and the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, the way we did now. All right, folks. So let me just do one thing here for you quickly. I know we're getting to the end of the hour here, and some people are going to have to move on. So let me put something here in the chat window for you. These are a couple of links to some of the free resources on our website. And again, if you're watching us on YouTube, this information will be below the video in the more info below the video. But here in the chat window, if you want to check out our free resources, we have a lot of really good free resources on our website. A lot of things that, you know, if you're studying on your own, a lot of resources like the brief email series, our blogs, our Manhattan Prep LSAT blogs have a lot of good information that can help you if you're self-studying, kind of help you get pointed in the right direction. And you can attend session 1 of any of our classes for free. So our courses, our 10-session courses, are open to anyone in session 1. You do have to register. You have to sign up. But you can attend session 1 of any, and I think some people said they've done this already. You can attend session 1 of any of our courses for free. You get to sit down on the real live session 1. It's not just like a sales pitch or a kind of fake sort of class. It's actual for real session 1 of our 10-session courses. Some of the information we go over is going to be similar to what we did now. We talk about arguments a lot in session 1. But that's just a really good way to see what our courses are about. And if you're not really interested in taking a course, you can still come to session 1 and get some good information and some good, get pointed in the right direction. And we talk about logic games and logical reasoning. So anyway, those are the options. You can click on one of those links, either in the chat window or below the video on YouTube to get more information about this stuff. For everybody who's joined us tonight and for anybody who's joining us, checking out the video on YouTube, I will say thank you very much for joining us tonight. I hope this was helpful, and take care. And